The most dangerous kind of contract is not the one written in ink, but the one that slowly begins to rewrite your life without asking for permission. I did not understand that when I first walked into the Whitmore Enterprises headquarters. At 27, I thought I had already experienced enough disappointment to recognize control when I saw it. I was wrong. The elevator doors opened directly into silence. Not the peaceful kind, the controlled kind. Everything inside the top floor of the building felt engineered to remove uncertainty. Glass walls, steel edges, perfect alignment, and at the center of it all Daniel Whitmore. He did not stand to greet me. He did not smile. He simply looked up from a document as if my arrival had already been accounted for in his schedule long before I stepped inside. Emma Carter, he said. My full name spoken like confirmation rather than introduction. Yes, I replied carefully. Sit, he said. No greeting. No worms. Just instruction. I obeyed because people do when they are standing in rooms like this. A legal assistant placed a thick stack of papers between us. The sound of it hitting the table felt louder than it should have. I glanced down. Contract agreement. Marriage terms. Duration 12 months. My throat tightened slightly. This is real, I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Daniel did not look at me when he responded. Yes. I scanned the pages quickly, expecting something hidden, something absurd, something that would make this easier to reject. But it was disturbingly simple. Marriage in name only. Public presence required. Private boundaries enforced. No emotional obligations. No interference in personal decisions. It read like a business merger, not a life arrangement. Why me, I asked quietly. Now he looked at me. Not with curiosity, with calculation. Because you are convenient, he said. The honesty should have been insulting. Instead, it was disarming. Convenient for what? I asked. He leaned back slightly in his chair. For what I need to resolve, he said. I should have walked out. That would have been the rational response. But life is rarely lived in rational moments. It is lived in pressure, debt, family expectations, situations that narrow until choice feels like illusion. Picked up the pen. My hand did not shake, but my thoughts did. You understand the conditions, Daniel said. I nodded once. I read them. Good, he replied. Because I do not repeat myself. That should have been the end of the conversation. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something I could not yet see. I signed. The moment ink touched paper, something subtle changed in the room. Not legally. Emotionally. Like a door had closed behind me without sound. Daniel collected the documents without celebration. Without acknowledgement. As if nothing meaningful had occurred at all. You will move in tonight, he said. I looked up sharply. Tonight? He stood, adjusting his cufflinks with calm precision. The arrangement begins immediately. I opened my mouth to argue but stopped. There was no point. People like him did not negotiate after decisions were made. They implemented. I left the building 1 hour later with a folder that contained my new legal identity and a future I had not chosen freely. Outside, the city felt unchanged. Cars moved. People walked. Life continued as if nothing significant had happened. But everything inside me knew otherwise. Because somewhere between signing my name and stepping back into daylight, I had crossed into a life that no longer belonged entirely to me. And I had not yet met the part where Daniel Whitmore stopped treating this like a contract and started treating it like something far more personal. By the time I arrived at Daniel Whitmore's residence, the sun had already begun to fade behind the skyline, stretching long shadows across the city streets. The address alone had been enough to remind me that this was not a normal arrangement. It was not a shared apartment or a modest home. It was a private estate in one of the most controlled districts of the city, the kind of place where silence felt intentional rather than natural. A driver opened the door for me without speaking. I stepped out slowly, holding onto the small suitcase I had packed in a hurry, and looked up at the building in front of me. Clean lines. Expansive glass. Perfect symmetry. Nothing about it felt lived in. Everything felt managed. The door opened before I could knock. Daniel stood there, dressed in a simple dark shirt, sleeves rolled slightly at the forearms, as if even his appearance had been reduced to efficiency. You are late, he said. I checked the time immediately. I am exactly on time. He looked at me briefly, then stepped aside.
Come in.
The interior was even more controlled than the exterior. Minimal furniture. Neutral colors. No personal objects visible anywhere. It did not feel like a home. It felt like a system designed for temporary occupation. I followed him inside, placing my suitcase near the entrance. You will use the room upstairs, he said without looking at me. Third door on the left. I nodded, expecting nothing more. But instead of walking away, he remained still, watching as I took in the space. There are rules, he said finally. I looked at him. Of course there are. He did not react to my tone. First, you maintain public appearance when required. Second, you do not interfere in my work. Third, you do not bring outside influence into this arrangement. I crossed my arms slightly. And what do I get in return? His gaze met mine directly. Stability. That answer was so clinical it almost made me laugh. Stability is not a benefit, I said. It is a concept. Daniel stepped slightly closer, just enough that I could feel the weight of his presence more clearly. In your situation, it is a necessity, he said. I held his gaze for a moment longer than I intended. There was something unsettling about how calm he remained while defining my life in such precise terms. Fine, I said finally. I will follow the terms. He nodded once. Good. Then he turned as if the conversation had ended. I expected to feel relief when he walked away. Instead, I felt something closer to displacement, like I had entered a space where my presence had already been accounted for but not truly welcomed. I carried my suitcase upstairs, finding the room exactly where he said it would be. It was large but empty, with only a bed, a desk, and a chair.
No decoration. No worms.
I sat down on the edge of the bed and looked around. This was not a shared life. It was coexistence under structure. Later that evening, I returned downstairs to find Daniel in the kitchen. He was not cooking, only standing with a glass of water, reading something on a tablet. You do not eat dinner? I asked before I could stop myself. He did not look up immediately. I do. Not always at home. I leaned against the counter slightly. So I am expected to eat alone? He finally looked at me. You are expected to do what you normally do. That answer lingered longer than it should have. Normal did not exist in this place. At least not for me. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the counter across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with structure, like even silence had rules here. Why did you choose me? I asked quietly. His eyes remained on the tablet for a moment longer before he set it down. Because you do not interfere, he said. That is not an answer, I replied. It is the only one you need right now. I frowned slightly. Right now? Daniel stood, placing the glass down beside him. You will understand in time, he said. Then he left the room without another word. I remained sitting at the counter long after he was gone, listening to the quiet of a house that did not feel like it belonged to either of us. And somewhere beneath the surface of that silence, I began to realize that contracts were never just about terms. They were about control, timing, and everything that had not yet been revealed. The first night in Daniel Whitmore's house did not feel like the beginning of a marriage, even one written on paper. It felt like entering a place where time moved differently, where everything had already been decided before I arrived. I barely slept. The room upstairs was quiet in a way that made every small sound feel amplified, from the distant hum of the city outside to the subtle creak of the building settling into the night. I kept replaying the same thought. I had agreed to live with a stranger who treated life like a contract with no emotional clauses. In the morning, I came downstairs earlier than expected, hoping to establish some sense of normal routine. The kitchen was empty at first, but I could hear movement from the adjoining space. When I stepped in, Daniel was already there, standing by the counter with a tablet in one hand and a cup of black coffee in the other. He looked up briefly when I entered. You are up early, he said. So are you, I replied. He did not respond to that, only set the tablet down and took a sip of coffee. There was something unsettling about how naturally he occupied silence, as if it belonged to him more than the room itself. I opened the refrigerator, noticing it was fully stocked but completely unpersonal. Everything was arranged with precision. No signs of preference. No trace of individuality. Do you always live like this? I asked without turning around. Like what? He replied. Like nothing is allowed to be unplanned, I said. A pause followed. When I turned, he was watching me again, not with curiosity but with assessment. Planning prevents unnecessary outcomes, he said. I leaned against the counter slightly. Not everything in life is an outcome. That is where most people make mistakes, he replied calmly. The conversation should have ended there, but it did not. Instead, I found myself sitting across from him at the kitchen island, a space that already felt more like a meeting table than a dining area. You said last night that I do not interfere, I said. Yes. Then why me? His gaze stayed steady. Because interference creates variables, he said. You do not. I frowned slightly. That is not a compliment. It is not meant to be, he replied. I let out a slow breath, trying to understand the logic he seemed to operate under. Then what am I in this arrangement? I asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he set the coffee down and looked at me more directly than before. You are consistent, he said. That word felt strangely heavier than anything else he had said so far. Consistent how? I asked. You do not create instability in environments that are already controlled, he replied. I looked away briefly, processing that. So this is about control, I said quietly. Everything is about control, Emma, he said without hesitation. Hearing my name in that tone made something inside me tighten slightly. I stood up from the counter. That is not how relationships work, I said. This is not a relationship, he replied immediately. The correction was sharp but not emotional. It was factual. I turned back to him. Then what is it? Contract, he said. Nothing more. The simplicity of his answer should have made things clearer. Instead, it made everything more complicated. Because if it was truly nothing more than a contract, then why did the silence between us feel like it carried weight? Why did his attention feel more precise every time he looked at me? Why did I feel like I was being observed even when he said nothing at all? I left the kitchen shortly after, unable to continue the conversation without feeling like I was stepping deeper into something I could not yet define. Upstairs, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the city begin its morning rhythm. People moved below like fragments of a life I used to recognize. Behind me, the house remained silent but not empty. And somewhere in that silence, I began to understand that living with Daniel Whitmore was not about sharing space. It was about slowly realizing that every space I entered had already been measured before I arrived. By the third day of living in Daniel Whitmore's house, I had already started to notice patterns I could not ignore. Nothing in the environment changed randomly. Everything had structure. Even silence seemed to follow a rhythm, as if it was scheduled between moments of speech. I woke up earlier than usual that morning, not because I had planned to, but because my mind refused to stay at rest. When I came downstairs, Daniel was already in the living room. As always, he was dressed simply, precisely, without any visible sign of disorder. He looked up briefly when I entered. You are adjusting faster than expected, he said. I paused near the staircase. To what exactly? To the environment, he replied. I frowned slightly. That is not something people normally adjust to like a system update. He studied me for a moment before responding. Most people resist structure, he said. You do not. That answer stayed with me longer than I expected. I moved toward the kitchen, trying to ignore the feeling that every interaction was being evaluated rather than experienced. Do you ever have days where you are not analyzing something? I asked without turning around. There was a short pause before he answered. Rarely, he said. That honesty should have created distance. Instead, it created curiosity. Later that morning, I received an unexpected notification from my workplace requesting my immediate presence for a project update meeting. I prepared quickly, leaving the house without discussing it. Daniel did not stop me, but as I reached the door, I noticed him watching from the hallway. You will return by 6, he said. It was not a question. It was a statement. I hesitated slightly. I have a meeting, I replied. I am aware, he said. That was all. The office felt familiar compared to his house. Predictable. Human. But even there, I could not fully detach from what I had begun to experience at home. During the meeting, I found myself distracted, thinking about the way Daniel spoke, the way he observed, and the way he defined everything in terms of structure and outcome. After it ended, I stayed behind for a few minutes, trying to clear my thoughts, but a new message appeared on my phone. It was from Daniel's assistant. Mr. Whitmore requests your presence at a scheduled dinner engagement this evening at 7. No further details were included. When I returned home at exactly 6, Daniel was waiting in the entrance hall. You received the message, he said. Yes, I replied. Good. I removed my coat slowly. What kind of engagement is this? A business dinner, he said. With clients. I nodded slightly. That sounded normal enough, but something about the way he said it made it feel less like an invitation and more like an assignment. At 7 sharp, we arrived at a private restaurant overlooking the river. The setting was elegant but controlled, similar to everything else connected to him. People stood as Daniel entered, acknowledging him with subtle gestures of respect. I followed slightly behind, unsure of my role in this space. Throughout the dinner, I noticed something unusual. Daniel did not introduce me as a stranger. He did not explain who I was. Instead, he positioned me naturally beside him, as if my presence was already understood by everyone in the room. At one point, a guest asked how long we had been married. I hesitated, but Daniel answered before I could speak. Long enough, he said. The simplicity of that answer shifted the atmosphere in a way I could not immediately interpret. Later, as we left the restaurant, I finally spoke. Why did you answer like that? He glanced at me briefly. Because explanations create unnecessary interpretation, he said. I looked at him carefully. That is not an answer, I said. It is a method, he replied. We walked in silence for a few moments before I spoke again. You keep saying everything is about structure or method, I said. Do you ever just live without calculating outcomes? He stopped walking for a moment, then looked at me directly. Everything has an outcome, Emma, he said. You simply do not always see it yet. The way he said it made me realize something uncomfortable. In his world, even my presence was not accidental. It was positioned, measured, and already accounted for long before I ever agreed to any contract at all. The shift happened gradually, so slowly that at first I did not recognize it as a change at all. It began on a morning that looked exactly like every other morning inside Daniel Whitmore's house. The same quiet structure, the same controlled silence, the same feeling that everything had already been placed into position before I arrived. But that day, something in his behavior felt different. Not obvious, not emotional, just slightly less distant than before. I noticed it when I entered the kitchen and found him not at his usual standing position by the counter, but seated at the table instead, a rare deviation from his established pattern. You are observing me differently today, he said before I even spoke. I paused halfway through pouring a glass of water. I am not observing you, I replied. He looked at me calmly. You are. I hesitated slightly before sitting across from him. If I am, it is because nothing here makes sense in a normal way, I said. That is because you are still measuring it using normal reference points, he replied. I leaned back slightly in my chair. And what reference points am I supposed to use? He studied me for a moment before answering. System-based understanding, he said. I frowned slightly. That sounds like something you would say to avoid giving a real answer. A faint pause followed. Then he nodded once. It is also accurate, he said. That should have ended the conversation, but instead it only made me more aware of how differently he processed everything around him. Later that afternoon, I stayed in the house while Daniel worked in his office upstairs. I tried to focus on normal activities, answering emails, organizing personal documents, attempting to rebuild a sense of routine. But the environment made it difficult to think in ordinary terms. Every space felt intentionally structured, as if even randomness had been removed. At one point, I found myself walking through the hallway and noticing a locked door I had not paid attention to before. It was slightly recessed, blending into the wall almost too seamlessly. When I stopped in front of it, I heard footsteps behind me. You should not be standing there, Daniel said. I turned slowly. I was just looking, I replied. He stopped a few feet away. That room is not part of your access area. I frowned slightly. Access area? He nodded once. This house is divided into functional zones. I studied him carefully. Even your home is structured like a system? Everything is, he said. The simplicity of that answer made something uncomfortable settle in my chest. I crossed my arms slightly. You talk about everything like it is controlled, measured, assigned, I said. What happens when something does not fit into your system? His gaze did not shift. It is integrated, he said. Or eliminated. The final word was calm, but it carried weight I could not ignore. I looked at the door again briefly before speaking. And I am which one? I asked. For the first time in days, Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked at me longer than usual, as if evaluating something that could not be categorized easily. Then he spoke quietly. You are still being determined. That answer should have reassured me that I was not yet defined. Instead, it made me realize that in his world, even uncertainty was temporary. Later that evening, I found myself standing near the large window in the living room, watching the city lights flicker into existence as daylight faded. Daniel entered the room quietly and stopped a short distance behind me. You are thinking too much, he said. I turned slightly. That is not something you get to control, I replied. A pause followed. Then he stepped closer, but not enough to invade space. Control is not about restriction, he said. It is about understanding. I looked at him carefully. And do you understand me? He did not answer immediately. The silence between us stretched longer than usual. Finally, he said, I am beginning to. That single sentence shifted something I had not expected. Because for the first time since I had signed the contract, I realized the structure I thought I had entered was not fixed. It was evolving. And I was no longer certain whether I was inside it by choice or because I had already become a necessary part of it. That evening, the house felt quieter than usual, as if even the air inside had adjusted itself to a new kind of stillness. I noticed it the moment I came downstairs and found Daniel Whitmore already standing by the window again, his usual position of observation unchanged, yet something about his posture felt slightly less rigid than before. He did not turn immediately when I entered. You are late, he said calmly. I glanced at the wall clock. It is exactly 7, I replied. A brief pause followed. Then he turned his head slightly. You are adjusting your internal reference to precision, he said. I frowned slightly. That sounds like you are analyzing even my arrival time. He stepped away from the window and moved toward the center of the room. Everything is analyzed, Emma, he said. The difference is awareness. I crossed my arms lightly. Awareness of what? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied me for a moment longer than usual. Of structure, he said finally. That answer no longer surprised me, but it still unsettled me in a way I could not fully explain. I walked toward the kitchen counter, needing something to occupy my hands. Do you ever consider that not everything needs structure? I asked. There was a short silence behind me before he replied. That depends on the outcome, he said. I turned slightly. You always come back to outcomes. Because outcomes define consequences, he replied. I let out a slow breath. Then what is my outcome here? The question made the room feel heavier. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked closer, stopping at a distance that was still controlled but closer than before. That depends on your adaptation, he said. I narrowed my eyes slightly. Adaptation to what? To this environment, he replied. I shook my head slightly. You speak like I am part of a system test. A faint pause followed. Then he said quietly, you are not a test. That was the first time his tone changed slightly. Not softer, not warmer, but more precise. More careful. I studied him carefully. Then what am I? I asked again. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked away briefly toward the hallway as if considering whether to continue at all. Then he spoke. You are the first variable I did not eliminate early, he said. The words landed heavily between us. I felt something tighten in my chest. That is not comforting, I said. It was not meant to be, he replied. I looked at him longer this time. There was something in his expression I had not noticed before. Not emotion, not vulnerability, but restraint. As if everything he said was filtered through something internal I could not access. Why keep me here if I do not fit your structure? I asked quietly. Daniel walked back toward the window, looking outside for a moment before answering. Because not everything that does not fit is removed, he said. Some things are observed until they become understood. I felt the weight of that sentence more than any other he had said so far. Observed, I repeated. Yes, he said. I stepped back slightly. So I am still being observed? He did not deny it. Instead, he said, you are being recognized. The distinction between those two words felt small, but the meaning behind them felt enormous. I turned away from him, trying to process the implications, but before I could respond, My phone rang unexpectedly from the counter. Picked it up quickly. The caller ID was unfamiliar. When I answered, a formal voice on the other end asked for confirmation of my identity and my current residence status. I froze slightly. "Who is this?" I asked. There was a brief pause before the response came. "This is regarding the contractual marriage registration between you and Daniel Whitmore." My breath slowed. I turned slightly, looking back at him. He was already watching me, calm, unmoved, as if he already knew this moment was coming. And in that instant I realized that whatever I thought this arrangement was, it had already moved far beyond something I could simply step away from. The call ended before I could fully process what I had just heard. A contractual marriage registration confirmation. The words kept echoing in my mind as I stood in the kitchen holding the phone slightly tighter than I realized. When I finally lowered it, Daniel Whitmore was still standing where he had been, watching me without interruption, without surprise, without urgency. That was what unsettled me the most. "You knew," I said quietly. It was not a question. He did not deny it. "Yes," he replied. I took a slow step forward, trying to keep my voice steady. "And you did not think I needed to know?" Daniel moved slightly away from the window, his expression unchanged. "It was not relevant until now," he said. My frustration rose immediately. "Not relevant? This is my life you are talking about." He looked at me directly. "It is a legal structure you agreed to," he said calmly. I felt my hands tighten slightly at my sides. "I agreed to a contract," I said. "Not to being processed like documentation." A brief silence followed. Then he spoke again, quieter this time but no less controlled. "The contract is being recognized officially now," he said. "That is all." I shook my head slightly. "You keep reducing everything to systems and procedures," I said. "Do you ever think about how this feels from my side?" For the first time that night, something in his expression shifted slightly. Not emotion but attention. "I consider all variables," he said. "That is not an answer," I replied immediately. He stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance. "Feelings are not variables I can quantify," he said. I stared at him for a moment, searching for anything behind the words. "Then why do it at all?" I asked quietly. "Why this contract?" A long pause followed. This time he did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. "Because stopping it was not an option," he said. That answer should have clarified something. Instead, it only made things more complicated. I took a step back slightly. "You keep saying things like that," I said. "Like I am supposed to understand without context." Daniel did not move. "Context will not help yet," he said. I let out a slow breath. "That is not how communication works," I replied. "In most systems it is," he said. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to steady my thoughts. "You are not talking about systems anymore," I said. "You are talking about people." A pause followed. Then he said quietly, "People are part of systems whether they accept it or not." I opened my eyes again, looking directly at him. "Then what am I in your system?" I asked. For the first time, he did not answer immediately. His gaze stayed fixed on me longer than before, as if the question required a level of precision he had not fully prepared for. Finally he spoke. "You are an exception," he said. The word hung in the air between us. I frowned slightly. "That is not comforting," I said. "It is not meant to be," he replied again. The same phrase. The same controlled tone. But this time it felt different. Because I was beginning to understand that being an exception in Daniel Whitmore's world did not mean being free from structure. It meant being the one thing the structure had not yet learned how to contain. And somewhere deep inside that realization, I felt the beginning of something shift that I could no longer reverse. The moment I said the word exception was the moment everything inside the house felt different again. Not because anything physically changed, but because something between Daniel Whitmore and me had shifted in a way neither of us acknowledged out loud. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not empty but charged, like it was holding back something that had not yet been named. I stood near the kitchen counter, still processing the conversation, when Daniel finally turned away from me and walked toward the living room. "You are overthinking it," he said without looking back. I frowned slightly. "That is your answer to everything," I replied. He stopped near the edge of the room, his posture still controlled, still precise. "Overthinking creates distortion," he said. I let out a slow breath. Or it creates clarity, I said. A pause followed. When he turned back toward me, his expression was unchanged, but his attention felt sharper than before. Clarity comes from verified data, he said. Not assumption. I shook my head slightly. You talk like people are data points, I said. He did not deny it immediately. Instead, he studied me for a moment. People generate patterns, he said. Patterns can be analyzed. That answer should have frustrated me more than it did. Instead, it made something uneasy settle in my thoughts. Because the longer I stayed in his world, the more I began to realize he truly believed what he was saying. That evening, I received another notification from the registry office confirming the formal recognition of the contract marriage. It was not optional. It was procedural. I sat on the edge of the bed upstairs holding the document on my phone, reading the same lines over and over again, trying to understand how something so personal could be handled with such detachment. When I came back downstairs, Daniel was in the study. He did not look up when I entered. It is official now, I said quietly. Yes, he replied. That was all. No reaction. No sift. I stepped further into the room. Do you feel anything about that? I asked before I could stop myself. He finally looked up. Feelings are not part of the structure, he said. I frowned. That is not normal, I said. Normal is irrelevant, he replied. I crossed my arms slightly. Then what is relevant? He stood slowly, walking toward the window again. Control, he said. Stability. Continuity. I looked at him carefully. And where do I fit into those three things? For a brief moment he did not answer. That silence felt different. Not mechanical. Not calculated. Something closer to hesitation, though I could not be sure. Finally he spoke. You disrupt none of them, he said. I tilted my head slightly. That sounds like avoidance, I said. It is classification, he replied. I let out a quiet laugh, though it carried no humor. You really do not see me as a person, do you? I asked. He turned slightly toward me. I see you as you are, he said. That answer should have been simple. Instead, it made everything more complicated. Because I did not know what as I am meant in his world. I stepped closer to the window beside him, looking out at the city lights below. If I left tomorrow, I said quietly, what would happen? Daniel did not look at me immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. That scenario is not part of the current model, he said. I turned to him. That is not an answer. It is, he replied. And for the first time since this arrangement began, I realized the most unsettling part was not the contract itself, or even the control behind it. It was the fact that Daniel Whitmore had already accounted for my absence, and still decided I was something he could not afford to remove. The room felt different after I said nothing in response to Daniel Whitmore's last statement. That scenario is not part of the current model. I had repeated those words in my mind so many times that they started to feel less like a sentence, and more like a boundary I could not see. I stood near the window for a long time after he left the room, watching the city below, trying to understand how a person could speak about another person as if their absence was simply a missing variable in an equation. When Daniel returned later that evening, he did not announce himself. He simply entered the space as if he had always belonged to it. You are still thinking about earlier, he said before I could speak. I turned slightly toward him. Of course I am, I replied quietly. He stepped closer, stopping at a distance that felt unchanged from before. You are assigning emotional meaning to structural language, he said. I frowned slightly. Or maybe you are removing emotional meaning from everything you say, I replied. A brief silence followed. Then he looked at me more directly than he had earlier. That is not accurate, he said. I let out a slow breath. Then explain it in a way that is accurate, I said. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the desk, placing his hand lightly on the edge as if grounding himself in the physical space before responding. There are conditions in systems, he said. Variables that cannot be predicted but still exist within boundaries. I tilted my head slightly. And I am one of those variables, I said. He looked at me for a moment longer than usual. Yes, he said. That single word should have felt like confirmation. Instead, it felt like recognition of something neither of us fully controlled. I stepped closer into the room. If I am a variable, I said, then what happens when I stop behaving within your expected range? Daniel's expression remained steady. Then the system adapts, he said. I crossed my arms slightly. And if the system cannot adapt? He paused. That pause mattered more than anything he had said so far. Systems always adapt, he replied finally. I looked at him carefully. That sounds less like certainty and more like avoidance, I said. For the first time, something subtle shifted in his expression. Not emotion. Not softness. Something closer to restraint. You are interpreting intention where there is only structure, he said. I shook my head slightly. I do not think that is true anymore, I said. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked away toward the window, as if considering something beyond the conversation itself. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. You are changing the way I classify outcomes, he said. I frowned slightly. That is not a normal thing to say to someone you are legally married to, I replied. He turned back toward me. This is not normal, he said simply. The honesty in that answer should have made everything clearer. Instead, it made everything feel less stable. I took a slow breath. Then what is this, really? I asked. Daniel walked closer this time, stopping at a distance that felt deliberate rather than accidental. It is continuity, he said. I studied him carefully. Continuity of what? For a long moment he did not answer. The silence between us felt heavier than before, not empty, but full of something neither of us was willing to name. Finally he spoke. Of something that did not end when it should have, he said. I felt a slight tightening in my chest. That is not an answer I can understand yet, I said quietly. He nodded once. I am aware, he replied. I looked at him for a long moment, trying to find something in his expression that belonged to a normal explanation, something I could anchor myself to. But there was nothing like that there. Only certainty. Only structure. Only something that had been in motion long before I ever signed my name on a contract. And in that moment I realized the most unsettling truth was not that Daniel Whitmore had chosen me, but that somewhere in his system I had never actually been an entry point at all. I had been a continuation.